chain belt in Kung Fu. Bruce Lee was my teacher. Watch this. That's a quarter blood technique. Do it, a quarter of blood drops out of a person's body. Well, those immortal words of Eddie Murphy could have been said, I don't think they were, unfortunately, but they could have been said during an altercation that we're going to talk about this week on Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Thursday, May 30th, 2024. And I have with me two dear colleagues from the Institute for Justice to talk about a couple recent cases from the Federal Courts of Appeals, which I'm delighted to provide to you today. So Jared and Sam, that is Jared McClain and Sam Gedge, welcome.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony.
Both, of course, repeat guests here on the podcast. Now, I did, though, want to start with a couple explanations for what's going on here at Short Circuit for our audience. Now, dear listeners, you may have noticed the last few weeks that sometimes you'll have an episode like recorded a couple weeks ago, and the next episode will be like even older, and they're a little bit random. Now we've been talking about recent cases from the Federal Courts of Appeals. We're not a breaking news podcast, so it's not like if a case is 2 days old, we're doing something wrong. But some listeners may have been a little confused by that, and I want you to know we are working on some big plans here at Short Circuit. And we are getting the kinks out of those plans, getting something ready. You're not going to lose anything you love about Short Circuit. We're just making things even better. And it's part of that. We're having a little bit of a different recording schedule, basically. But just want you to know everything's fine. And so keep listening. Also, one thing that we haven't done that much recently, but we'd like to do more of in the future, and we have done a lot of in the past, are our Short Circuit Lives, especially at different law schools. So we had one this spring at the University of Virginia. That was great. We're going to have our annual Supreme Court preview at the University of North Carolina in the fall. But we would love to go to other places. If you are a law student and you would like Short Circuit to come to you, please reach out. We'd love to come to your school. Often we are invited by student groups. We're often invited by Student Federalist Society chapters, sometimes student ACS chapters, American Constitution Society. But we will come whatever your group is. If you have, an international law association or criminal law association or a golf law club, and you want us to come and talk about a couple recent golf cases, that'd be great. We would love to come to you. So please feel free to reach out. You can reach out to me, to John Ross, or to Anya Bidwell. You can find us all on the IJ website, and we would love to coordinate with you, bringing Short Circuit to wherever you are. But right now, we're going to bring Short Circuit to you via the podcast waves, and we're going to start with Jared with this case from the D.C. Circuit about how to get documents out of the Capitol Police. And it seems like it's pretty difficult.
Yeah, I think the plaintiff here and his attorney found out just how difficult it was probably from oral argument and then from the decision. So the case is called Jason Leopold versus J. Thomas Manger, who is the chief of
Manger, perhaps even.
Yeah, it's probably not Thomas then. Who's the chief of the United States Capitol Police, and it was originally a mandamus, or I guess it is a mandamus action, but it started in the district court as one, and it's about whether the public can access the Capitol Police's records from January 6th. Specifically, Jason Leopold, who used to be at BuzzFeed, among other places, and now is at Bloomberg, he wanted access to 101 directives that the Capitol Police had in effect on January 6th, along with audits and reports that the Capitol Police's Inspector General's office sent to the agency's board after January 6th. And then, in addition to these access to these two sets of records, he also wanted to compel the Inspector General to comply with its statutory requirement to post certain reports online. And to accomplish all this, Jason Leopold was relying on this case, really a set of cases out of the DC Circuit, named Washington Legal Foundation. They call them WLF 1 and 2. And these cases explained that the public has a common law right to access public documents, which the DC Circuit has defined as a government document created by any of the three branches of government that is kept for the purpose of memorializing or recording an official action, decision, statement, or other matter of legal significance, and this is supposed to be broadly conceived. And the Capitol Police, on the other hand, argued that the common law right of access doesn't apply to their written directives or their IG's audits and reports because the statute exists that prevents the release of any security information unless the Capitol Police's board has determined that it can be released. And the agency said that their review team had looked through 65 of these 101 directives and also looked through the audits and the reports and determined that they were security information, and because they're security information, they don't have to disclose them. And Leopold lost before the district court, and so he's up on appeal, and the DC Circuit starts with confirming that it has jurisdiction over this mandamus action, whether it can issue. It confirms that it can issue a mandatory injunction to the Capitol Police, and then it goes on to decide the real issue in the case, which is whether sovereign immunity bars this government agency, bars Leopold's request to make this government agency produce public records. And the court applies what it calls the Larson-Dugan standard, which is named for two Supreme Court cases from 1949 and 1963. And under this Larson-Dugan standard, the courts may enjoin federal officers from taking actions or require them to take action only if it's something that the sovereign has not empowered the officer to do, or if the thing that the sovereign has empowered them to do is unconstitutional. At bottom, this is really just an ultra vires inquiry, and the idea is that courts can only enjoin ultra vires actions of government officials under sovereign immunity. And on the same day that the DC Circuit issued this opinion, they issued an opinion in a companion case called Schilling versus House of Representatives, which goes into a little more detail explaining the basis of this rule. And the same panel in that case said, absent an applicable exception, claims against the federal government and its actors are jurisdictionally barred by sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity, the court explained, is deprived from the British common law doctrine that the king was infallible. And so what this suit comes down to is Jason Leopold is saying that the common law has created a public right to access public documents, and the court is saying that courts have adopted the British principle that the king is infallible and now have applied that to the federal and the state governments. So our governments are infallible, even though we fought the entire revolution to get rid of that
details
that idea. And so this is admittedly, I guess self-admittedly, this judge created doctrine that is saying that the public can't access public documents based on sovereign immunity. And like for me from the outset, that sets off red flags, because the sovereign at least as I understood it from, like the Constitution is that we, the people, are sovereign, and that the government is not this separate entity that has rights and interests that are separate from the people. But the courts in America do not agree with that theory, I guess. So they go on to analyze whether the Capitol Police's actions are ultra vires, and because it's only if they aren't authorized by law can the court compel them to do something. And the Capitol Police argue that there's only two categories of stuff that falls into this exception to sovereign immunity. They say it's only if an officer exceeds their grant of statutory authority, or if the statutory authority that they're relying on is unconstitutional. And the court slaps this back, and they say that the Capitol Police are cherry-picking language from one paragraph of this Larson decision from the Supreme Court 50, 60 years ago to create a new type of immunity. And so like that starts off with some pretty strong language against the government, and makes you think that the court is going to take seriously the public's right to access public records. And the court goes on to say that it's always been clear that there's more than just two ways an action can be ultra vires, and it points to these other circuit decisions that have held that courts can enjoin an officer who abridges a common law duty without statutory authorization, and the common law right of access would fall within one of those common law duties. So basically the idea is that if the public has a common law right to access these documents, and there's no statute forbidding it, if Congress hasn't supplanted the common law, then the government has to turn over the records. And then the court also rejects the Capitol Police's argument that the common law right of access doesn't apply to legislative documents. It says that they've already rejected this in the Washington Legal Fund decision, and that comes from an implication from the Supreme Court's decision in the case about access to Richard Nixon's documents, which said that the access to documents also includes the judicial branch and the executive branch, and the court infers from that it extends to all three branches. It doesn't matter whether it is an executive document or a legislative document, it is still subject to this common law right of access. And so having sort of beaten back those preliminary issues that the Capitol Police injected into the case, it moves on to the merits. And this is where things take a turn for Leopold, because the court says that Leopold has to clear 3 high hurdles if he wants access to public records. He has to show first that there's no other adequate way for him to acquire the documents. Second, he has to show that his right to a writ demanding the release of the documents is clear and indisputable, and that it will compel only a ministerial duty, which is another way to say that if there's some discretion involved about whether to release these documents, then the court can't require the other branch to release them. And third, if he can clear those first 2 high hurdles, he has to convince the court that the writ is appropriate under the circumstances. And the court just stops there after listing those three hurdles and says, here's Mr. Leopold's big problem. He has not pleaded nor briefed how or why each form of relief that he seeks is ministerial. This oversight effectively kills Mr. Leopold's claims. And so we're about 4 sentences into the merits, and we already have a very strong signal that Mr. Leopold is going to lose his case. But the court goes on and continues to address his arguments. It says, I guess backing up, it says the reason that not briefing this second prong, this ministerial duty and this clear and indisputable right to access is so important is because it's actually an issue of first impression in the DC Circuit, and they haven't set out the standard that court applies, and they note that courts throughout the country have taken differing approaches when it comes to this determination, and it's not immediately intuitive how the DC Circuit should answer that decision about whether the decision to provide access to a public document is ministerial or discretionary. And they don't get into it, and they don't take a position on it, but they do note several state court decisions that have held that it's a discretionary duty to release documents. But in all of those decisions that the DC Circuit relies on, it was a statutory right of access and not the common law right of access. And those statutes vested the record keeper with certain discretion to withhold documents. And it's not clear to me, and it's not clear from the opinion, how that would map onto the common law right of access and where the government would get any discretion over whether or not to release documents. But the court goes on anyway and addresses the first argument, which is whether or not these are public records. It recites its standard that it set out that I mentioned a couple minutes ago from WLF2, but then it cautions that it also has said that it should, even though the definition itself says it should be broadly interpreted, that it should also be interpreted narrowly to avoid the court having to do a balancing test on documents that are just preliminary or advisory, or for one reason or another don't effectuate an official action or decision. And the court sides with Jason Leopold on this issue, and the court says that these directives are not merely preliminary or advisory, despite that's what the district court held, and it's what the Capitol Police are arguing on appeal, but the DC Circuit disagrees. It says that these are final policies memorializing the adoption of an official policy. And the court says, look, there's one here on the policy that Capitol Police officers are supposed to apply when they conduct searches of persons. And the court says, you can't tell me that a police officer just gets to look at this policy and consult it and then decide whether or not they want to follow it, like it's just a guidance document and not memorializing an official policy. And it says, just because not all of these policies might have been applied yet, that doesn't make them any less final. And you can't really get around the fact that these are final directives that apply to all of the Capitol Police. So it agrees with Leopold there, and it also agrees with Leopold that the district court erred by not ordering a Vaughan index, which comes from FOIA law. And basically what the court did wrong here was it issued a sweeping ruling on 101 different directives without actually looking and analyzing at what each of the different directives were and what category they fall in, and how to assess whether they should be open to the public on an individual basis. But then after giving these two Pyrrhic wins to Leopold, the court pivots back and says it's not going to go any further than that. It has to affirm the dismissal of Leopold's case because Leopold didn't brief a necessary element for mandamus relief. And the court says, though, that he can choose to refile if he wants, but he must identify the clear and indisputable non-discretionary duty that the Capitol Police are required to fulfill, which is just a long way of saying he has to show that they don't have any discretion to withhold these documents that he wants. And so that's his first claim that he loses on. The second is that in 65 of these 101 documents that were designated as security information, Leopold says, look, there's no real evidence supporting that designation. And beyond that, the Capitol Police don't even contend that the entire document is security information, just that it includes security information. So Leopold basically wants the Capitol Police to redact or sever the parts of these documents that are confidential and to release the rest of it. But the court says even if we're to conclude that designating an entire document exceeds the Capitol Police's statutory authority, Leopold would still have to show that there's a clear and indisputable material duty to segregate those portions of the documents, the same standard that he failed to meet on his first claim. And so he loses here too, because he can't show that the common law right extends to the public portions of documents that contain non-public information, mainly because it was also unbriefed. And so this is another one that if he chooses to refile, he will get to make an argument for why, even if some part of a document is privileged, the rest of it has to come out. And finally, the court turns to Leopold's statutory claim. And this is a statute, it's 2 U.S.C. 1909, that says the Inspector General shall carry out the same duties established under 5 U.S.C. 404. And 5 U.S.C. 404 is just the General Inspector General statute that apply, because all these different agencies have IGs, and there's one statute that governs their behavior, basically. And then all of these subsequent statutes creating the separate IGs incorporate those rules for each respective inspector general. And that overall statute, the 5 U.S.C. 404, says not later than 3 days after submitting a recommendation for corrective action in final form, the inspector general has to post it on its website. And Leopold says this creates a clear duty to publish. But the court says, wait. When Congress created the Inspector General for the Capitol Police, 5 U.S.C. 404, this General Inspector General, I should stop saying General Inspector General, but the IG Act didn't yet include the public posting requirement. And so there's an open question about whether when a statute incorporates another statute by reference, and that the incorporated statute gets amended, whether those subsequent amendments automatically incorporate into the other statute. And while that sounds like a complicated, if not intuitive, question, the court says it doesn't have to resolve that either, because another statute says that the Inspector General is forbidden by law from disclosing information otherwise prohibited by law. And the Capitol Police issued an order saying that all of these reports are security information, and Leopold didn't raise an argument that that designation doesn't count as quote unquote the law. And because Leopold didn't present any arguments on that issue, the issue is conceded. And once again, he gets to try again and make that argument for the first time if he decides to refile the case. And that's where things end. It's the court sets out, basically more clearly articulates the standard that Leopold has to file, and then gives him a do-over if he wants one. But what the opinion shows, I think, is just how difficult and how daunting the standard is for a reporter or a member of the public to get access to records that are public records when the government does not want to disclose its records to the public.
And you don't have the benefit of the Freedom of Information Act, right? Because this is basically outside of the purview of that.
That's right. And I do appreciate that the panel here went further, and after they said that he was going to lose, sort of explained what he would have to show anyway, because this issue comes up in different spaces, and it's come up about in the context of PACER charging fees. It's come up in government statutes and regulations that incorporate by reference private documents that are behind a paywall. And so basically, whether the government can create law that is hidden behind a paywall for one reason or another, or charge access to. And in all of these decisions, much like this one, the sense that I get is that the panels kind of think that people should have access, but they are scared of the precedent that they would create if they actually said so. And there's usually a little procedural tick that gets in the way that leaves them no choice but to dismiss the case and wish the plaintiff better luck next time. And that is what happened here.
Sam, do you have thoughts about the common law right to public documents?
I don't. I was going to interrupt Jared's flow when he was referring to IG's plural and suggest maybe it should be ISG, since the general would be a post-positive adjective.
I think that's right.
You were on a roll. I didn't want to throw you off. I don't know. I mean, this was a real opinion. This was a dense thing to try to get through when I read it this morning. I mean, the thing that kind of jumped out at me, I think, was similar to Jared, which is that it was a really long opinion for a bottom line, which was this guy didn't effectively brief any of the stuff that we care about. Like, you would imagine that most opinions that have that bottom line would be like one page, but they really did go the extra mile with a very dense 22 pages. And in a way, I wonder whether Mr. Leopold is just really fortunate that he happens to be in this context where the jurisdictional inquiry kind of overlaps with the merits inquiry, right? Because if it were just the merits inquiry, I assume his failure to make the arguments means that he loses on the merits as a with prejudice loss, and he might have a hard time kind of coming back and filing the same case and trying to do a better job with better arguments. There might be some real problems there. But because the merits analysis was kind of filtered through this jurisdictional lens, he can basically lose on the merits, and it's a jurisdictional loss, not a merits loss. And it sounds like the DC Circuit says, great, let's spend another few years litigating all this stuff again from the ground up. And I don't know, it struck me, it's all very strange and confusing, but you did yeoman's work, Jared, in explaining it to me, at least.
Well, and a lot of it has to do with the oddness of the whole mandamus procedure. I had one case a long time ago where I did mandamus in Georgia state court, where I did a mandamus action, and it's kind of weird. Like you think, well, maybe we could go for mandamus, and the mandamus is really just a court order to do something that an official is supposed to do anyway, and not something that, well, maybe the official sometimes does it, maybe they don't. Like, it has to be that they have to do it. So the trouble is, you need the law to be super clear that they have to do it. Which the problem here is, of course, because it's kind of like it's a common law right, and it's a little unprecedented. It's a little bit like qualified immunity, as we'll talk about in a moment. If it's a little unclear, well, then you're probably not getting mandamus because it has to be clear, which is really too bad for someone who is asserting that right in the first place. But if it is clear, you actually can get a lot of oomph and a lot of power out of a mandamus action. And there's not a lot of defenses to it. But getting to that point is very difficult, especially in this context.
Yeah, I like the analogy to qualified immunity, because it is one of those things where, like, if courts would start issuing these and establishing that there is a right of access, then it would be a lot easier to show how clear your right of access is. But because they all sort of end in this like piddling dismissal where someone didn't do something right, or something's a little unclear, there's never access, and it compounds the problem. I think that mandamus is just an incredibly unfortunate vehicle to get access in the first place, because courts always say, whenever it's mandamus, they love to say this is an extraordinary writ. We only grant these in extraordinary circumstances. But the right being asserted here is that the government has no right to withhold these documents in the first place. They belong to the public. They should be released to the public. And in my mind, it should operate a little something like strict scrutiny, where the government needs to make a really strong showing of why they need to withhold the document. Like, if you can't just wave your hand and say security reasons, like, is someone actually going to get put at risk? Because if so, you could maybe withhold it. But to just say everything the police does relates to security information, so you can't see any records that this federal police force that was like in charge of like overseeing a coup attempt, like you just never get access to any of that, because mandamus is an extraordinary writ, and the government as its own separate entity has this right of maybe has some discretion to withhold public documents from the public, is really, to me, just seems like the wrong way of going about things.
One interesting other nuance that I'll close with is that this is a common law right, they're calling it, to documents from Congress in the District of Columbia, from Congress in this case, the District of Columbia. And so really it's federal common law, right? Because it's the District of Columbia court is articulating this common law right. I was thinking, so the case they cited at the beginning is a Nixon case from the Nixon tapes era in Watergate. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, as I shared with you guys before we started recording, this seems like something kind of like made up in the 70s that courts did a lot of back then. But actually, I've looked back at that case, and there are earlier cases. So it's goes back to the 1800s, actually, this kind of common law right. But it's a little bit it's a little bit of a vestige of federal common law that, of course, the whole Erie doctrine, for lawyers out there who know that whole thing, doesn't apply because it's not a state. It's the District of Columbia, and yet they have this, that they're dealing uncontroversially, it seems, with this concept of the common law, even though we're in the federal zone where usually you don't think about common law. So anyway, a little bit of a metaphysical point to end on. So Sam's going to get metaphysical with a question about when someone becomes unconscious. So Sam, please explain where we draw that line.
Well, I think the bottom line is that we don't actually have to, because of qualified immunity, Anthony, so we can all go home. Did you, by the way, make your parental advisory? Because
No, I haven't yet. Yeah. So Sam is going to go, because of the nature of this case, Sam is going to go into some language that perhaps some parents would not want younger children listening to hear. So there's your parental advisory. And now, Sam, just, it's time to be blue.
Thank you, Anthony. Ordinarily, I would be uncomfortable about saying words like motherfucker on your podcast, Anthony, but a big takeaway that I got from this opinion was how refreshing it was that the Seventh Circuit did not, in fact, expurgate any of the profanities. And we can talk about that.
Yeah, it's right there. Minutes. It'll be in the Federal Reporter, unedited.
Indeed. And I feel like it would be hypocritical for us to say that that's the way things should be while ourselves expurgating it on your very distinguished podcast, Anthony. So anyway, the facts. So we're in Evansville, Indiana. It's 3 a.m. A police officer is driving around. He sees a gentleman asleep on a utility box outside of a bar. And he suspects, based on his experience and training, that the man may be drunk. So he stops and he engages with the man, who is kind of drowsy. He mumbles that he can sleep wherever he wants. And the officer says, "No, you can't. And actually, I can take you to jail." And then the man responds something to the effect of, "Take me, motherfucker, take me." And it kind of goes on from there. The officer sees what he thinks is a debit card sticking out of the man's pocket, so he reaches for it. And the guy's reaction, honestly, isn't that unreasonable to me, because he tells the officer not to reach in his butt, which I guess is what he thought was going on based on the placement of the debit card. And at that point, things take a turn, because the man, from a sitting position, he hits the officer in the face with an open hand. Which seems to set the officer off. So he grabs the guy's shirt and he punches him 4 times in the face over the course of 4 seconds or so. And it turns out that the officer himself holds several black belts.
I didn't know you could have more than one black belt, by the way. I guess they don't transfer across martial art disciplines.
Yeah.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think you got to get them in the different things.
Oh, okay. Because I feel like if you're in one discipline, they put like just different color stripes on your belt, I think, right? I don't know. Anyway, we can circle back on that.
I don't think there's reciprocity is what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. No, that could be right. Anyway, so it turns out he has a bunch of black belts, and he's also trained as a competitive fighter. And he ends up doing a lot of damage to the guy. The gentleman's knocked unconscious. If we're viewing the facts in the light most favorable to the man, he's knocked unconscious after the first of the 4 violent punches to his face, maybe the second. His eye socket is fractured. His nose is broken. He gets lacerations for which he needs surgery. And he ends up suing the officer for excessive force under the Fourth Amendment. At summary judgment, though, the officer raises qualified immunity, and the district court says no. A jury could find that beating this guy's face to a pulp was excessive, especially given that there's a fact question about whether the officer continued punching him in the face after he was unconscious. And because of this being a qualified immunity issue, the officer gets an immediate appeal. We've grumbled about that many times, so insert standard grumbling here. It goes up on appeal. And the Seventh Circuit reverses. The panel says we're not going to decide if the officer used objectively unreasonable force, which is kind of the standard for Fourth Amendment excessive force claims, because even if he did use objectively unreasonable force, he gets qualified immunity because it wasn't clearly established that he couldn't do what he did. And the court says, yeah, maybe the officer kind of could have interrupted his flurry of face punches to see that the guy he was punching from close quarters was unconscious. He might well have been able to do that, but since it all took place over about 4 seconds, it's not clearly established that the officer had to reevaluate or recalibrate his use of force over such a short period of time. So he gets qualified immunity and case closed. And I think there's a couple of interesting things going on here. The first is that the panel, there's also a short concurrence, and the concurrence kind of touches on this too, but both of them really seem to go out of their way to try to say, we're not setting a bright line rule, or not setting a pro-face punching bright line rule under the Fourth Amendment, basically. We're not saying that anytime officers get threatened, that they get 4 free seconds to get as many face punches in as quickly and as hard as possible. Definitely don't read this opinion as saying that. And the current says the same thing. They say this is a narrow ruling. It shouldn't be overread. No safe haven for punching faces generally. But as I'm reading the opinion, I kind of have a hard time seeing how that's necessarily right. Because if, and I think this is what the opinion stands for, but if as a matter of law, the officer in these circumstances and on these facts was entitled to qualified immunity, I have a hard time envisioning a situation where, a different officer in the Seventh Circuit who faces even a modest threat from a suspect can't kind of safely count on getting his good 4 seconds of face punching in before he faces any liability.
The 4-second rule.
Yeah, precisely. So the 4-second rule that the majority and the concurrence said definitely doesn't exist, but might exist. Because here it seems like, the level of the threat here was quite low, right? Like it's not nothing, right? You have a guy slapping him in the face, right? But the guy's drowsy. He's sitting on the ground. He does like an open-handed face slap. And the officer,
roundhouse, they call it.
So yeah, he like really did a big wind up, but it ended up being open-handed. I guess there's body cam footage, which maybe we could get a copy from the court since it wouldn't be on Pacer. But at the same time, like this officer is a martial artist, so right, like presumably his hobby is getting punched in the face. Like he does that in his off time. You would think he would be used to it. And yet his reaction, despite being kind of like the opposite of an eggshell police officer, his reaction is that he proceeds to beat this guy's face in with his bare hands up to and after the guy's visibly unconscious, at least taking the facts in the light most favorable to the guy. So if this officer in these circumstances gets qualified immunity, I just have a really hard time hypothesizing an officer who doesn't get qualified immunity for responding to even a modest threat from a suspect by battering their face in for up to 4 seconds. I don't know. So it kind of feels like a bright line rule to me, despite the concurrence and the majority saying that it's definitely not a bright line rule. And it seems like the fact that both those opinions felt the need to really say that over and over again makes me a little bit more nervous that maybe it really is a bright line rule. Otherwise, why would we be insisting that it's not? And there, at least as I read the opinion, there was no obvious way that it wouldn't apply to most officers dealing with even a mildly resisting suspect. So we can turn to the expurgation, Anthony, unless you want to talk about the actual substance.
Jared has thoughts on the bright line rule first.
Yeah, I think to Sam's point, in the 11 page, it's not even 11 full pages, the majority opinion, and they emphasize 8 separate times that this all happened within 4 seconds. And that really is what the majority, I guess, and the concurrence, what they're hanging their hat on. And the punchy here, the drunk guy who got his face beat in, said, look, if you rule in his favor, you're going to create this bright line rule. And they say, no, we're not. But to Sam's point, I really don't understand how that's the case. And I guess the other thing that stood out to me is that both the majority and the concurrence were using the point of unconsciousness as the point at which this guy became subdued. And I don't understand why that's the case. So basically their analysis was the cop should have stopped beating this guy up once he lost consciousness. But the standard that they should have been applying is once this guy was no longer perceived as a threat. And the majority themselves acknowledge that this black belt officer's black belts, this, I don't know how you pluralize that one, but this multiple black belt officer had a purely instinctual reaction, I guess because of his training in martial arts, to really just pummel this guy past the point of unconsciousness.
That seems like a problem.
Right. And so the idea that because it was only 4 seconds, we're trying to like draw the line at the point of unconsciousness, but the point at which he should have stopped using force was the point at which this drunk guy no longer posed a threat to him, which presumably should have been one or no punches. Like you probably don't need a punch to presume a guy who was literally just passed unconscious, drunk on an electrical box outside of a bar. And and I think it's just another way that the courts are creating special treatment for police officers. Because if you'd pardon me my own little digression before we get to Sam's, I in elementary school I took karate, and our karate instructors had these like rubber Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle costumes, and they used to go put on like they'd fight foot soldiers and stuff at put on shows, and they're at the Cumberland Mall in the middle of nowhere, New Jersey, putting on one of these things, and then they like take their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle heads off, and they're packing up and getting ready to go, and a guy who is on drugs comes up and pushes one of these karate instructors, and he turns around and punches the guy once, and the guy falls back, hits his head, and dies.
Wow.
And
that took a real turn.
Yeah, but the state fully went with the idea that this guy is a karate instructor. He knows that his hands are weapons. Like, he has formal training. He should know better. And he, like, when you know how to severely hurt someone with martial arts and then you do that, you should be held to a higher standard. Mm-hmm. And here it seems like the opposite is happening, and he's allowed to go into a 4-second fit of rage in which he just blindly pummels an unconscious man.
One other thought before we get to expurgation, and Jared, you reminded me of, is that it seems like, so they approach this man first to see if he's okay, and they ask him if he's okay, and he says no. So obviously he's had a rough night. But then the reasoning that, and the court says this like it's no big deal, the reason why the officer keeps kind of coming to him and seeing what's in his pocket and all that is, one, to see if he's okay, and two, to get his name to do a check if he has an outstanding warrant. Why is he even doing that? Why is he even thinking of doing the outstanding? Of course, the reason is, if I found an outstanding warrant, I can just bring him down to the slammer, which is what I guess standard protocol is. Standard protocol shouldn't be that here. It should be like, make sure this guy's okay, maybe get him a cab home, call his girlfriend, whatever it is, maybe give him a ride home, and not, but the one thing I could do other than just, see if he's dead is see if I can lock him up. It's absurd.
By physically trying to reach into his pockets to take his identification.
And then that escalates things.
Yeah.
Yeah, sleeping people don't like when someone's reaching into their butt.
Yeah, indeed.
So Sam,
words to live by.
Now it's over to you.
Well, yeah. So I guess we should preface this by acknowledging, Anthony, that this was I was a last minute addition, your last choice of person to be on the show. And you asked me yesterday.
I had a long list. Everyone else blacked out. No, okay, I guess it's Sam.
But anyway, so one of the things that I thought was refreshing about this opinion is that the panel didn't expurgate all of the motherfuckers that were said during the incident. And I don't know, I think reasonable minds can differ on that, but it always has struck me as kind of a peculiar stylistic choice for some judges. Like, it kind of varies, I think, by judge, but for some judges to use asterisks instead of just writing, motherfucker and the like. If in fact, the fact that someone said that word is relevant enough to put in the opinion, like, why are we putting these dainty asterisks in there? It strikes me as particularly peculiar that we have that practice because, judicial opinions kind of by their very nature, I think, deal with some of the most vile and the most violent and the most, adversarial and atrocious and blood-curdling incidents that happen in our society, right? That's most of what judges do, is offer a forum for adjudicating, doing justice in the face of those kinds of horrific incidents. And the opinions that we read every day, they talk about all of these incidents and horrific things in all sorts of candid detail, as they have to. And it's always just struck me as very off-putting, kind of faux delicate, I don't know, to pair discussions of murders and, face beatings and all that sort of thing with these dainty little expurgated asterisks whenever someone happens to use a rude word in the midst of, like, shooting someone to death and things like that. So anyway, all of this, Anthony, kind of sent me down a rabbit hole, as you know, because I gave you a heads up like 20 minutes before this started. That went me down a rabbit hole about kind of the first use, at least according to Westlaw, of the word fuck in an American judicial opinion. And it was the product of about 10 minutes of research, so I can't pretend that this is authoritative. For motherfucker, it's 1963, I believe. It's a First Circuit decision, where it was in a footnote, and it actually felt quite gratuitous. It looked like they were looking for a reason to put it in.
Wanted to be the first.
I think it might have been, yeah. So yeah, that was 1963. But based on my 10 minutes of research, the word fuck was first used in its un-expurgated form in this really just delightful Missouri Supreme Court decision. And it was either from 1846, which is what Westlaw says, but possibly 1835, because there's an 1835 decision that seems to cite this 1846 decision, which the mathematicians among us will know doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But anyway, early kind of antebellum Missouri. It's a case called Edgar versus McCutcheon. It's a very short opinion. And basically what happens, because I just think it's a fun opinion, and you can cut this, Anthony, if you want, but so Mr. McCutcheon sued Mr. Edgar for slander, and he alleged that Mr. Edgar had accused him of carnal knowledge with a female horse. Mr. Edgar had apparently used the word fuck to convey this allegedly slanderous message.
He didn't say carnal knowledge.
The more restrained justices of the Missouri Supreme Court used that. But no, Mr. Edgar, a man of the people, told all and sundry that Mr. McCutcheon had fucked the horse, apparently. And Mr. Edgar's defense to the slander suit was that because the word was not recorded in English dictionaries at the time, it must necessarily be, quote, unknown to the English language, and thus not possibly understood by those to whom it was spoken. So it couldn't be slander. No one could possibly have known what I meant because the word's not in the dictionary. And the Missouri Supreme Court, you will be surprised to hear, did not buy this very creative argument. And its reasoning, I think, it boils down to basically one sentence. Like, it's a very short opinion. The court says, because the modesty of our lexicographers restrains them from publishing obscene words or from giving the obscene signification to words that may be used without conveying any obscenity, it does not follow that they are not English words and are not understood by those who hear them, or that chaste words may not be applied so as to be understood. So, I don't know. It's a pretty fun little opinion.
That is very impressive language by the court. I think I'm persuaded.
Yeah. And again, I regret the unexpurgated part of this podcast, Anthony, but it would just seem too incongruous for us to be dancing around the words while praising the Seventh Circuit for not doing that.
So yeah, an unheralded fact of our language is that many of these words, including the word you just said several times, are quite old. And I think fuck is in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, and you can go back and look to it being used in many ways and many times. It's just that we kept it out of written materials most of the time until, I guess, recently, until the Federal Reporter started putting it in there. So that is impressive. We could have a whole show about the history of some of these words in the courts. Maybe we'll have to put an advisory right up front on that one, but it might be interesting.
Yeah, I'm just impressed that Sam managed to connect this case about the Kung Fu Cop with the 1846 horsefucker case out of the Missouri Supreme Court.
It has not been cited as often as you might think. While we're on the subject, this is a digression from the digression, Anthony. I think one of the most my most favorite literary expurgators is Patrick O'Brien, the author of the Aubrey Maturin series. And he sometimes would expurgate these kinds of words and other times wouldn't. And there's just been a lot of kind of literary debate about like why, because he was obviously very thoughtful in all of the words in his books. He's one of the best writers in the English language, some would say, including me. And yet he clearly put a lot of thought, like some of his characters, they'd be expurgated, sometimes they wouldn't be.
But in the actual novel, the characters,
yes. So in the novel,
asterisks that.
Yes. Yeah.
What's
so
the point? He's not quoting. It's not real.
It's not real. So I mean, so a couple of thoughts on that, Anthony. So I don't know. I haven't done a deep dive on that. I didn't have time in the 20 minutes before this show.
But you had time to find Edgar versus McCutcheon.
Well, I did. My Westlaw search history will never be the same, I'm sure. But no, I think so. One, he like modeled his writing after Jane Austen, and she would, I think she or folks who like wrote in her style in that period would in fact kind of do the expurgation even in fiction. And some theories for him are that like the more kind of refined characters, when they use those kinds of words, they're expurgated. But if it's just like someone below decks, like someone who isn't an officer, maybe they don't. But the real tie-in with the Evansville, Indiana case is that if you go elsewhere in Indiana, to the University of Indiana at Bloomington, they actually have the originals of most of Patrick O'Brien's handwritten manuscripts on file, and you can go visit them and check them out if you want.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I just actually did a short little reading group on Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice mostly. And she would talk about where someone was, like a county that someone went to. And sometimes she would have a dash, like dash shire, as though she didn't want to, it's all made up anyway, but she just wanted the reader to fill it in for themselves. I was a little confused by that, but if she's doing it for that, she's probably doing it for swear words.
She probably is. I think so. I have here, Anthony, which you may get a kick out of, the memoirs of the Countess of Cardigan, who's the second wife of Lord Cardigan, who led the charge of the Light Brigade, the Battle of Balaclava in 1854. And I believe in here that she would sometimes dash out the names of certain like duchesses and whatnot who were kind of getting up to no good. So maybe it may have just been like a practice of the time.
Okay. Well, we'll have to turn back to that last book later. But for now, thank you, gentlemen. This has been quite a tour. Public records, punching, and swear words. So thank you. Everyone else, please listen in next week when we will have more from the Federal Courts of Appeals at whatever time that the episode was recorded. But in the meantime, I hope that all of you get engaged.